For over 4 centuries, the public imagination has held a very specific picture of Shakespeare's most famous protagonist. He is the melancholic prince, a fragile, brooding intellectual, standing alone in the dark and paralyzed by the weight of his own mind. This framing gained traction in the 19th century. Romantic critics viewed him as a soul too delicate for the brutal reality of his political mission. Later, Tsarist Russian thinkers used the term Hamletism to categorize a specific kind of political vacillation and disengagement. But the definitive label for Hamlet's hesitation came from psychoanalysis. Sigmund Freud analyzed the prince's inability to act through the lens of clinical neurosis, specifically identifying a latent Oedipal complex. Freud's disciple, Ernest Jones, expanded on this thesis. He argued that Hamlet subconsciously resented his uncle for committing the very crime he secretly desired, removing his father to monopolize his mother's affection. 20th century cinematic interpretations, like Laurence Olivier's iconic film, cemented this reading. The prince became a hypersexualized, neurotic patient, pacing the halls of Elsinore, lost in his own psychological labyrinth. Even Jacques Lacan, who approached the play through the structuralist concepts of language and lack, kept the character firmly pinned to the psychoanalytic operating table. Viewing Hamlet as a psychiatric patient focuses entirely on his internal wiring. This approach risks shrinking the play's scope, treating structural and systemic problems as if they were merely individual symptoms. Elsinore functions as a harsh, real-world fortress, a militaristic environment facing an immediate threat of war from Norway. Modern critical consensus offers a sharper lens. Hamlet is a highly ethical, deeply rational agent attempting to navigate a corrupted world. When he is commanded to kill the king, his progress is obstructed by 3 distinct, intersecting forces that force him into a state of suspended animation. There is the external political reality of operating inside an authoritarian surveillance state. There is the epistemological challenge of receiving orders from a supernatural source that cannot be easily verified. And there is the severe ethical risk of eternal damnation. This suggests that what we call delay might actually be a series of calculated responses, the inevitable friction created when an ethical agent attempts to move within a rigged system. The Elizabethan monarchy was sustained by a vigorous network of spies and informers. One historical portrait of the queen shows her in a costume covered in embroidered eyes and ears, advertising that her listeners were everywhere. Shakespeare imported this reality into Elsinore. The Danish court operates as an authoritarian panopticon, where every single personal relationship is weaponized for espionage. King Claudius and his chief minister, Polonius, readily deploy Hamlet's former school friends to sound him out. They even use Ophelia, the woman he loves, as a passive instrument of state surveillance. Surrounded by informants, Hamlet warns his few loyal guards that he will adopt an antic disposition. This madness acts as a calculated cryptographic layer, designed to mask his internal logic from the state. We see the tactical nature of this disguise in the way his sharp, analytical private intellect directly contradicts his babbled, nonsensical public behavior. This gives the Shakespearean soliloquy a specific functional role. When Hamlet speaks alone to the audience, he is using the only secure, unmonitored communication channel available to him in a police state. His erratic behavior is a required survival tactic within this environment, ensuring he remains unreadable to those watching him. Standard Elizabethan revenge tragedies followed a predictable, mechanical path. A ghost demands vengeance, and the hero acts swiftly and violently to restore honor. Hamlet actively subverts these rules. Instead of rushing to draw his sword, he pauses to question the reliability of his primary source, the ghost itself. This reflects a common theological concern of the era. Apparitions were widely suspected to be demonic forces assuming pleasing shapes to lure the living into mortal sin and damnation. To bypass this uncertainty, Hamlet engineers a play within the play, which he calls the mousetrap. He uses the performance as a scientific stress test, designed to force a visible, undeniable reaction from the king. The experiment succeeds perfectly, extracting the raw truth from Claudius as he abruptly halts the performance in a sudden panic. By prioritizing empirical proof over immediate violence, Hamlet reveals himself to be an investigator before he is a killer. Armed with proof, Hamlet finds Claudius alone, kneeling and completely vulnerable. At this moment, the traditional revenge plot requires an execution, yet he stops. A sudden theological calculus enters the equation, because Claudius is attempting to pray. According to the religious logic of the time, killing a man during confession would guarantee his soul a direct path to heaven. Meanwhile, Hamlet's own father was murdered without the opportunity for confession, leaving him trapped in the agonizing torment of purgatory. Executing Claudius now would satisfy earthly revenge, but it would fail the requirement for true cosmic justice. The blade is stayed not by a lack of nerve, but by a rigorous adherence to the spiritual consequences of his actions. Viewed through an existential lens, to be or not to be evaluates the meaning of existence. He weighs stoic endurance, suffering the slings and arrows, against active resistance. As the text notes, this creates a moral paralysis where neither option is fully justifiable. The debate pivots from physical pain to metaphysical dread when he considers the undiscovered country of death. The absolute impossibility of knowing what lies beyond that border makes any definitive action, especially taking a life, an infinite risk. Hamlet concludes that conscience does make cowards of us all, using the word conscience to denote intellectual awareness and the weight of overthinking. His inability to unknow the complexity of the universe generates an inescapable rational paralysis. To break this deadlock, the play shifts outside the claustrophobic castle and into the absolute reality of the graveyard. Here, the dirt acts as the ultimate equalizer. The complex narratives of politics, revenge, and love eventually collapse into silent dust. Holding the skull of Yorick, a man he loved in childhood, Hamlet realizes that a specific identity eventually drains away into an anonymous, interchangeable bone. The universal nature of death mocks meticulously engineered ethical plans. Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar eventually serve to plug holes in a beer barrel. Confronting the undeniable certainty of death shatters his paralyzing need for perfect, engineered justice. Upon returning to court, Hamlet undergoes a final ideological shift. He surrenders to a higher order, which he calls providence. He abandons the burden of controlling every outcome. Rather than trying to force the interlocking systems to bend, he allows them to resolve themselves. When he declares that the readiness is all, he is describing a state of philosophical acceptance, replacing active plotting with spiritual preparedness. Shakespeare re-engineered the revenge tragedy to prove that in a corrupted world, true justice requires confronting and ultimately surrendering to the limits of human knowledge.